Hello and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel-Fleissig. With the final leg of the first phase of the deal between Israel and Hamas still in question, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is set to meet with various relevant players in the region, including in Doha, Cairo, and Riyadh, in an effort to extend phase one of the deal. Israel has conditioned the release of Palestinian terrorists upon halting the grotesque staged ceremonies of Israeli hostages, a show that Qatari-owned Al Jazeera has been provided exclusive access to cover. With us today to understand how this tiny peninsula has gained so much influence on geographical events is Dr. Ariel Admoni, a faculty member of the Middle East Department at Bar-Ilan University and a guest lecturer at the Cambridge Gulf Center. Hello, Dr. Admoni. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we try to dissect the Crown's current behavior in our own war, why don't you give us a brief outline of the major events that led this traditionally marginal regional player to its current role?
It's a long answer, but I'll try to shorten it due to the format. Qatar, since the 1980s, especially after the exploration of gas started in the North Field, tried to put itself on the map, tried to use foreign policy as to talk with everybody, not to be loyal to no one, and to take care mainly for Qatar. For that purpose, we see several of initiatives. Qatar Airways, Al Jazeera, you mentioned the last one recently, but part of it's what scholars described as soft power. Qatar also use its connections with terror organizations, and in that manner they try to position themselves, and they succeeded, to position itself as the go-between for the Western world. The one that's gonna talk with the Taliban, the one that's gonna talk with Hamas, and these are just the two major examples. There are others. And this is why when we are trying to evaluate Qatar's status right now, we need to put in mind history context.
Okay, very interesting. Can you explain this kind of duality between Doha's, menacing practices to destabilize the West, from direct sponsorship of terror activities to, as you mentioned, its use of soft power through funding political activities on campuses and maybe even Ivy League academic institutions themselves, and its status as peacemaker or maybe peace broker in the current talks? How does this duality exist for them?
Okay, many ask and none good answer came, but nevertheless, if Qatar sought to promote itself, they knew that the gas that I mentioned before, it's not the only source they can rely on. After all, the GCC state in general saw what happened when they rely on energy source. And this is why not just Qatar specifically, but Qatar use it in a spectacular way, use its investment authority to expand its influence in many regions. You mentioned the West, and we saw in the last year the fact that Qatar invests heavily, actually since the 1970s, in elite universities, not just in the US, also in Britain, in part of academic cooperation. We saw that scholars enjoy inviting into Doha. We saw the fact that the main goal of Qatar was to invite academic institutions to establish branches in Doha. Not just Western. Just yesterday, the board of Cairo University announced they planned also to establish a branch in Qatar. And this is just one example to the fact that the connection with the academic and university, academic establishment was instrumental to the Qataris, not just for foreign policy, but also as an instrument to present themselves. Any important visit in the last just weeks saw how the emir visit both India and Iran and Kuwait, and these visits included scholars that highlight the academic aspect of this relationship, and this symbiotic relationship between the academia that mostly need Qatari money and Qatar that need this legitimacy and need this, let's say, heavy lifting is important to characterize the nature of the types.
You mentioned Egypt just as an example. How are the other maybe moderate Arab states in the region responding to this kind of change, to the new kid on the block? Are they skeptical of Qatar's intentions, or do they consider it a partner in repositioning, perhaps, in the Middle East?
Let's say like that. The idiom they use, it's not the new kid in the block, it's actually the bad kid or the one that punch above his weight, because Egypt and Saudi Arabia and even the UAE was kind of angered by the fact that Qatar is not aligned with its interest, and the fact that you are part of the GCC, but at the same time, as they say it in caricatures, throwing nails under the GCC wheels, cutting the branch, and even some of them, Saudi caricaturists use even the grotesque caricature of a Qatari tumor, because he's poisoning ourselves from within. And this is why from in the last decade, the states tried to, let's say, put Qatar in order. They tried to corner it regarding its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. For this reason, we saw right after Emir Tamim, the current emir, rose to power, he tried to downplay the relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, tried to please Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Cairo. But bottom line, this duplicity continued, and we saw from 2017 the fact that there was embargo or a severance of ties. It depends who you ask. The UAE don't want to call it a boycott, but we saw that this coalition tried to, let's say, behave Qatar, but finally it failed because Qatar relied on ties with Iran, with Qatar, even increased its local production, and they learned the lesson from this crisis. Since then, they highlight the Qatarization of the workforce, the increasing of local production, and this is why, for now, its neighbors, mainly Saudi Arabia, understood that beyond, if American or Western backing not come, they need to, let's say, hold their grudge under the table. The front line remains. And we saw it in the media outlets. We see it in the fact that after October 7th, we saw ex-officials by Saudi and others denounce Qatar. But bottom line, these states understood they have to, let's say, put up with Qatari behavior, because without international backing, it's not going to happen.
So I want to get to, you mentioned the US, I want to get to them in a minute, when we bring the Israeli context into the conversation. But just before that, offline, you mentioned that Qatar is neither here nor there. We talked about the moderate Sunni states. We talked about Saudi a little bit. What about Iran? How is it viewing its very close neighbor as it's, this repositioning in the region?
First, when we talk about relations with Iran, we need to remember the fact that they have joint gas field. And the fact that unlike Qatar, Iranians were late to the party. They developed it much later. But besides energy, we need to remember that during this crisis, Qatar relied on Iran economically. And for that reason, the fact that since the settlement or Al Ula declaration um, in the beginning of 2021, Iran tried constantly to get back on Qatari good side in manner of economic relationship. The last visit of the emir was mainly about it. It's not was about. There was talking about Syria and was talking about the Gaza situation, of course, but the main issue was economic. Bottom line, Iran need Qatar more than Qatar need Iran. We saw it, for an example, after the overthrow of Assad regime. We saw that Doha was a communication channel between Al-Jolani and Tehran. And the fact that this duplicity continues, still, this is one of the 13 demands that Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt demand, downplay relations with Iran. But I think that this region in general learned that we cannot trust just one actor. And for this reason, Qatar not going, even if states will demand it from her, from it, it's not likely to happen that Qatar will decrease its relations. Rather, Qatar probably will, as they do in right now, will try to establish themselves as the link or the communication channel also between Iran and the US and Iran and other Western allies. We saw it during the Biden administration that the Qatari Prime Minister visited Tehran and announced that part of the agenda was to communicate about the nuclear deal. This way, Qatar want to establish himself both in Washington and in Tehran as the one you need to trust.
So maybe that's a good segue really to the next next part of the conversation on Israel and the current war. Can you maybe relate to the last things that you said in terms of acting as a mediator between even Iran and the rest of the world? How does its not only relations with Hamas, but its sponsorship of Hamas, its housing of Hamas leadership on its own turf, how does this all fit into its larger scheme, into its goals?
So, support of the Palestinian issue in general is not new to Doha. We need to remember that Palestinian foreign workers were in Doha in 1970. Even scholars describe it as the one that running Doha in official consultants in general. And at the same time, already when it's not, the inception of Hamas, the Mujawama al-Islamiyah by Ahmad Yassin in 1973, we have reports about Qatari funding because Qatar knew to, let's say, play both ends of the Palestinian issue, but at the same time, they are not aligned with any side because if we look right now on the situation, we saw that they bolster Hamas, sometimes under the facade of humanitarian assistance. Just the last phase of the deal include 30 million liters of gasoline by Qatar and bulldozers by Qatar with Qatari flags. Two instruments that Hamas knew how to use. We have also a situation in 2017. There were Qatari architects that entered Gaza under the claim that they gonna maintain the sewage system, but we can be assured due to Qatari support of Hamas that They also visit tunnels, and this Qatari support of Hamas wasn't under the table. I mean, officials like the mother of the Emir Sheikh Hamoza lamented Sinwar. We saw the Minister of International Cooperation, Lula Al-Khatar, later as Minister of Education, highlights Qatar Palestinian narratives in songs about Sinwar and Muhammad Def. We saw the fact that Palestinian schools in Doha projecting the image of the entire map of Israel under the Palestinian flag. But at the same time, when you ask Qatari Prime Minister, he announced that we support the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, because Qatar is not aligned. Even the foundation of Qatari Emir Mother, Sheikh Hamoza, we mentioned before, education above all, initiate a scholarship project in University Al-Quds in Abu Dis, because Qatar want to be the one that have a connection to the field. Hamas and other Islamist organization, we need to remember that Ziad Nakhle, the head of the Islamic Jihad, was also in the Doha several times. It's the Qatari way to ensure they will have the connection to the field. They not just fund corrupt politicians. They had enough of it. They want to be the one that have ties to the community itself. Terror is not a problem, so if it's terror, it's not a problem. But the main goal is that every Gazan, we knew that Qatar will come to rescue, allegedly.
Very interesting. So
Just a
obviously,
second,
yeah, go ahead.
For this reason, I think that Israel, you ask also about Israel, so Qatar is the most effective one. And we have to emphasize, Qatar claimed that all Qatari funding to Hamas was Israel approved. It's not entirely correct. Also, their narrative about the fact that Hamas presence in Doha was by a U.S. Request, but Qatar knew how to portray itself the way that the West gonna, let's say, can put a calm face regarding Qatari Hamas ties. But Israel, I think, mainly in the last decade, saw Qatar as the most effective tool if we want to communicate Hamas. We have to be honest, not understanding the problems of legitimating Qatar and Israel approval was ringing endorsement for Qatar. Also, in the same manner, we saw how Qatar invited Jewish leaders and Jewish newspapers to Doha. So if anyone want a Qatari paycheck, so. But seriously, the fact that Israel saw that this is the most effective kind of compelled Israel to avoid the problematic nature of Qatar and rely on Qatar to, let's say, buy quiet or communicate with the terrorists, not understanding the problems or ignoring it because the process issues of the hostages, etc.
So, given the situation that we're in now, in which probably, everything kind of snowballed and Israel didn't really prepare itself for this current situation. And now that we're after the fact in a situation which it has given legitimacy to this state sponsor of terror, what would your advice be for Jerusalem? And, you did write a few days ago that Israel needs to establish a special task force to deal specifically with Qatar, to examine what the next steps should be. What should that task force be doing? What do you envision will be its recommendations at the end of the day?
I think that if we talk about Qatari foreign policy in the last 3 decades, we saw it's very sophisticated manner. And for that reason, it's not it's not possible to think about like the situation in Iran, just cut them off. We talk about a country that just in the last days signed papers with Scale AI in California, Microsoft, UE, and just this morning a contract with a Chinese company to supply 20 years of helium to China. We cannot speak about Qatar as the one we just convinced the Americans to expel them, and this is gonna be the end of the story. And for that reason, I think more sophisticated manner is to play tough in the same arenas that Qatar knew to play so well. For an example, the boycott of Al Jazeera by Israel was a ringing announcement. It's and Qatari take offense and it's good, but Israel at the same times can proclaim that they want to send to studios or online Israeli spokesperson because Al Jazeera interviewed IDF spokesperson in Arabic. And this kind of move is an example to the fact that the pressure was on Qatar because Islamists around the world saw the fact that Israeli spokesperson and Israeli academics spoke on Al Jazeera and blame Qatar how you normalize de facto ties with Israel. And this kind of thinking is an example to the fact that we can be smarter regarding Qatar. Use the media outlets to our own good as Israel, use the business ties to, let's say, blame shame Qatar, and they have a situation where they need to blame shame, not just in the context of Israel. We need to remember that just in the last year, we saw several situations where confiscation of a holy book by India. We saw shaming or even a mistreat and even claim of abuse to homosexuals. And Qatar has a potential to be blamed for. And for that reason, you cannot just say attack Qatar or disengage Qatar. You need to sting, even may I say a lower definition, in the academic institutions and later in the press and later in the economical, financial, and later on official correspondence and diplomatic relations. This kind of thinking will probably bring more possible results that Qatar will, let's say, even afraid from Israel because they cannot predict Israeli perception. We need to be honest. Qatar knew how to read Israeli discourse. Just these days, we saw on Al Jazeera and on the horrific stages organized by Al Jazeera in Gaza, the fact that it was played for Israeli internal ear. They knew how to read the political and the social map of Israel. And for that reason, Israel needs to strike back in the same manner.
Right, and of course, the stages themselves were decorated with Hebrew, so this was, of course, directed at the Israelis, albeit Hebrew with spelling errors, but that's not the point. Do you have the same or similar recommendations for foreign policy for the bigger player, which is the U.S.? Do you think that the U.S. needs to adopt some kind of carrot and stick approach to Qatar to move it maybe from being the menace in the region to a more positive a positive player, for instance, doing something about its own military base in Qatar, or other kind of pressures, economic or otherwise? What do you think the U.S. administration should be doing, and does it even have an interest now, given the new administration there?
I think that Qatar is subversive also to the US. I mean, we saw academic gatherings in Doha that critic US tactics and US approach. We saw the fact that most of the times Doha will not be the one that officially criticize Qatar, but we will see the fact that I mentioned, of course, the academic gatherings, but the media outlets, not just Al Jazeera, also the Middle East Eye, Middle East Monitor, the Peninsula, Gulf Times, are very, very critical and sometimes use idioms and expressions that the US will not likely to be fond of. And this kind of thinking also use, let's say, other foreign delegations. For an example, just yesterday, the Ukrainian ambassador in the Qatari Peninsula, owned by the Qatari ruling family, published an op-ed about free Ukraine. It's a clear signal to Trump and his stance against Ukraine. Just a week before, the Cuba embassy, Cuba embassy in Doha published another kind of, let's say, not supportive U.S. announcement. And this kind of thinking that Doha tried to maintain its criticism toward the US, at the same time they maintain cordial relations with Washington, I think that this kind of situation is not productive for the US, especially not the one you trust. Indeed, let's be honest, I don't think that nor the Biden administration nor the Trump administration see Qatar as the problem. We need to remember that the most of, let's say, public discourse in the US see Qatar as the one that supports sports and academia and green initiatives. So this is why I don't think they say it in a problem. And let's be honest, the business oriented of Doha is very, very fit to US current administration thinking. And I don't think for that reason also that we're gonna see a bold move that's called to take the base out of Doha, for the main reason that Qatar funds most of the expenses, and this kind of arrangement is very, very comfortable to Trump policy. And I don't think it's realistic to expect this kind of change. The fact that Trump itself said that Qatari just want to help. Witkoff said about Qatari Prime Minister that he's doing God's work, doing the mediation. It's an indication, but Doha also secures itself by deals with Affinity of Kushner, deals with Tesla and Starlink and many other initiatives of Musk for a guarantee that, again, cut off Qatar will be the last result.
So we're almost out of time, but there are just two last questions that I'd like to ask. One of them relates to the fact, a few things that you already mentioned. You mentioned the kind of the green initiatives that the country is making while having, its own, pretty horrendous track record when it comes to carbon monoxide emissions. You also mentioned sports, and we're all aware of the World Cup being held there, and of course the major abuses to the labor force in order to have that happen in the first place. Do you envision a continued trend that Qatar, continues to try to do things on the international scale, if it's through international organizations, for instance, in order to continue putting its name out there as something green and good, despite its own shortcomings in those sections?
Yes, right now the ExxonMobil tournament of tennis championships ends in Doha, and we can see during the final the Emir sitting next to Nasser Al Khulaifi, high-ranking officials in the Qatar Investment Authority, and this kind of site appeared when Nasser al-Khulaifi is under investigation in France, doing two, let's say, not very clean conduct in the situation of France in general, but mainly in PSG, Paris Saint-Germain, that just announced, just a month ago, I think, announced they will continue its partnership with Qatar Airways until 2028. We need to remember that one before 2028, in 2027, we're likely to see FIBA World Championship in basketball. For this reason, Doha will continue to use sports event. And I think that we need to also notice another aspect. Visitors in the World Cup of 2022 noticed that it was good World Cup, but the most effective way that Qatar portrayed itself during the World Cup was the most secure World Cup. And since then, Qatar established himself as security contractor of the West. If you like to hold major sports events on your realm, you will likely to, let's say, rely on us. We saw it during the Olympics in Paris that Qatar was participant in the security arrangement. We saw it right now that Germany conducts in Germany joint operations with Qatari security operators about the maritime border. We saw it also during the US. During the Biden administration, there was a signing of memorandum of understanding between Doha and Biden officials, Homeland Security. And Qatar knew how to establish themselves. And sometimes we even saw there was an article 2 months ago in the peninsula owned by the Qatari government about Taekwondo coach, and I'm not very big on sport. It talked about the fact that doing sports in Qatar, it's not just a matter of sport, but also a matter of sustainability. And this kind of term, Qatar tried to put this term on every initiative they have to try to say we're not just good at sport, we're also good on the green agenda and on sustainability politics. And Qatar knew how to connect different realm of influence to, let's say, a well-organized policy that bottom line, economic aside, environment aside, we will ensure that Qatar will stay on top of it.
Very smart strategy. Just one last question before we let you go, and bringing it back to the news that's most relevant for our listeners. If the current talks dissolve between Hamas and Israel, how likely is it, or how likely do you think it is that that Qatar will pick up the reins again and try to, to restart the talks, and how much investment will it, it put in order to get the deal back, should it fall apart?
So first, we need to establish what's the Qatari goal. Unlike the Israelis and the Americans that want to seek a deal, Qatar's main goal, in my humble opinion, is not to seek a goal. It's not to seek a deal. The most important Qatari goal was to make sure they will stay in the closed room. They will be still the part of the decision process. They will be with footing in Gaza the day after, because they want to establish themselves. And in this context, we need to remember that they want to guarantee that despite, let's say, very, very different Trump approach, they will still be the one that Trump trusts. We saw the fact that when you ask Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan, even Jordan, about Trump's plan, we heard a clear objection to the plan. unlike Qatar, we have three responses by Qatar. One of them is too soon to tell, and the Palestinians will decide for themselves. The second one is just yesterday, the Speaker of the Shura Council in Egypt say we against every position to move Palestinians in some manners. He didn't mention Trump's name. And the third response was alignment with Riyadh and Egypt about the denouncing of this plan. So Qatar will, if this deal collapse, will try to assess where is Trump's position and how is the best way to make sure that Trump still sees them as the favorable son. If they will be convinced that pushing Hamas is gonna bring them results, I, for one, think that the fact that just yesterday Abu Marzouk from Qatar said that the fact that if he gonna knew how much destruction October 7th bring, he wouldn't initiate it, and I don't believe him, but I think that the fact he said it from Qatar is indication that Qatar will signal Hamas that we need to please right now the White House. So if you want the continuance of funding and humanitarian aid, you need to give us some leverage that we can come to Trump and say, look, we are still hold very strong leverage on Hamas. And this is just one instrument of influence that Qatar will seek in order to maintain the fact that we are going to be the go-between for Washington.
That's very interesting, and I think a good place to end our conversation. Dr. Ariel Admoni, thank you very, very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you to my colleague, Jonathan Beck, for facilitating this call. Goodbye, everybody.